fullest support, we are conducting these 3 days webinar. So on behalf of the PG Department of English, I welcome you, sir. Sir, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Also, I thank for all your inspiration, encouragement, also for having given permission for this webinar. Thank you and welcome, sir, once again. So, of course, I am extremely happy to welcome today's chief guest, the resource person, Dr. T.S. Alayyanagi, Assistant Professor of English, Department of English, Rani Anna Government College for Women, Tirunelveli, who is going to deliver a lecture on revisioning and rewriting as discourses. Welcome, madam. Alagi ma'am, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. I had kept my audio and video switched off so that
Wonderful, wonderful. A few words about our resource person. Everyone present here will surely be surprised to know that she is a gold medal winner in BA, MS University Tirunelveli, a gold medal winner in MA, and a gold medal winner in MPhil, Mother Teresa University, Kodaikanal. Such a great thing she has achieved. Also, she has passed SLET in November 1999 and NET in December 2000. Madam has participated in a lot of national, international conferences, seminars, workshops, and faculty development programs. She is also a certified trainer and examiner BEC program, British Council, Chennai. Also, she is Access Program Felicitator, US Consulate, Chennai, between 2005 and 7. Yes, she is the avatar of all good potentials. She is such a nice person and personality, kind, simple, and so merciful person with a high level organizational and linguistic skills. I thank you for having consented for this webinar. Also, I wish you all the best, madam. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
I do hope that this webinar will enrich us with the knowledge of revisioning and rewriting as resistance discourses. In that way, it will answer to many of our questions and clarifications regarding rewriting of earlier works and how it is getting reflected in the form of quotations, references, parody, imitation, and even translation. Also, the critical tools that are employed as effective strategies to rewrite these texts that would interpret and reassign a new meaning to the canonical texts. The terms like remix, remake, reform, reconstruct, refashion, reinvent, and recreate propel to novelty. In that way, revisioning and rewriting reviews and scrutinizes the sway of these ideas with relation to their original context and redrafts them for a new generation of readers, highlighting their ongoing significances. So I do feel extremely happy to welcome you all present in the webinar, professors, associate professors, and assistant professors belonging to various institutions, research scholars, PG students and UG students of literature, and other department faculty members. I welcome you all for to have a nice time here. Also, I welcome the faculty members of Kovilpatti Government College, also the students of various departments belonging to our college in a special way. I welcome all faculty members of my own department And a special welcome to Professor M. Gunasegaran and Dr. Sangeeta, the organizers who have made this webinar a successful one, and thanks to them also. Also, a special mention needed here. I especially welcome and thank to my friend K. Vignesh. He is our departmental as well as academic friend who is a well-wisher of our department. Once again, I welcome you all for this wonderful webinar and wish you all success. Thank you. Thank you, all the best. Now I request our principal to deliver the inaugural address. Sir, please.
Good morning to all. First of all, I wish a pleasant morning to everyone present in the first day state level webinar organized by the PG Department of English, Government Arts and Science College, Kovilpatti. I am really happy and feel proud of the Department of English of our college for having organized the state level webinar on revisioning and rewriting as resistant discourses. I do take proud that for the first time, the department has organized a series of state, national, and international level webinar as it shows the advancement of the department towards of a scholarly position. So I congratulate Dr. Joseph Suresh of the Department of English and faculty members of the Department of English for their efforts taken to elevate the ensign of instructive statements by the way of steering such erudite activities. Also, I wish them all success in all the endeavors. I appreciate Dr. Joseph Suresh, head of the Department of English, Mr. Gunasegaran, and Dr. K. Sangeeta, the organizers of the wonderful program. I do assure them of my unbounded support in the future for such productive plans to refurbish the department. I am immensely happy to welcome today's resource person, Dr. T.S. Alagiya Nayagi, Assistant Professor of English, Department of English, Rani Anna Government College for Women, Tirunelveli. Welcome, madam. Also,
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, madam. Also, I wish you to have prolific time with the platform. I do hope the session on revisioning and rewriting as resistance discourse will surely enrich the participants to find reports for their clarification and illuminate the perception of rewriting of earlier works. The term revisioning has a higher level of meaning as a literary work of art comprises a multiple connotations to be clasped at every reading and rereading. Once again, I welcome you all for this vivid and radiant academic gathering and wish you all to have an intensive, inventive time with us. Thank you all. Thank you. All the best. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, thank you for your nice words.
Thank you, sir.
Now you can switch over to the guest.
Suresh, sir, can I begin my speech?
Yes, of course. You can.
Okay. Good morning to all. It is indeed. Am I audible, Suresh, sir? Everything is fine?
Yes. You can go ahead.
Okay. It's indeed my pleasure and honor to meet you all in this webinar. I commence by expressing my sincere gratitude to Dr. R. Ravichandran, Principal, Government Arts and Science College, Kovilpatti. I accord my special thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Suresh Joseph, Head Department of English, Government Arts and Science College, Kovilpatti. Thank you, sir, for having invited me as a resource person. And I should say that the effort that you have taken to organize this webinar for 3 days in a state, national, and international level, it requires a lot of effort and a lot of hard work and patience. And I congratulate you on having taken such a massive endeavor and for doing it so beautifully. Okay. And Suresh sir, I should tell you all, is a very jovial and an extremely friendly person with whom you cannot help but be a friend. And he is actually
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
a very informed person in what you can say government orders and issues. If we have any doubts, we will just run to him. Sir, please tell us what happened to this, and he will keep us updated on all the government orders that comes to us and all that. Thank you so much, sir, for being such a pleasant friend over the past 10 or 13 years that we have known each other. And I fondly remember our days in our first orientation program at Bharatiyar University, Coimbatore. Such memorable days they were. Thank you. And again, I thank you, Joseph sir, for consistently inviting me to be a part of academic activities of the Department of English, Government Arts and Science College, Kolpati. And I also appreciate the organizing secretaries of the program, Dr. Gunasegaran and Sangeeta. My special wishes to you. You are such young people. You have just such a bright future ahead. God bless you. And the passion in your profession will take you to your places. And I also take this opportunity to personally appreciate and congratulate the whole team behind this triology webinar for the success and the excellent conduct of the series of webinars. My gratitude again to all the erudite professors, research scholars, and graduates who have spared their time and taken efforts to be with us in this webinar. Thank you so much. Now, moving on into the topic of this webinar, it's characteristically my style. I begin with a question. Since we cannot answer, even then I'll put a question for your thought. How many of us, as we read through canonical or classical works, or be it a literary work, as we read through, we have raised an eyebrow, suddenly we'll have a nagging question at the back of our mind, or we'll have a squeamish or uncomfortable feeling about the characters or the plot or the narration of the work that we have read? See, the answer is universal. Point or something we relate to, and we have questions in our mind. So the answer is a definitive yes, and I'm sure none would disagree. To me personally, the question that a text raises in a reader's mind renders it alive, vibrant, and interactive. See, that exactly is proper reading. Remember, silence may be everything is dead. Nothing is alive. It is a wasteland, as said by T.S. Eliot, or to quote Roland Barthes, the beginning point of revisioning and rewriting as a critical tool. It is not only the death of the author, but I would add to it by saying it is the death of a trinity, namely the author, text, and the reader. When we are not able to, bond with what we are reading, or it doesn't interact with our mind. I have experienced, and I am experiencing it with every reading that I do. And in my classroom, I put a persistent question. Why do we prefer a visual medium, for example, movies, to reading? What exactly could be the answer? See, well, my answer to this repetitive question that I ask in my classroom is, visual medium leaves nothing for imagination. Every emotion that you need to experience, whether be it sad or be it happy or be it romance, the experience is created through visual effects and music. So you automatically emote. For example, you switch off your audio when you are seeing a ghost movie or a horror movie. Much of the feeling of horror will be lost. And your mind simply sits and enjoys the very experience or the very pleasure of watching that movie. But seldom does your mind stretch beyond that. But reading is another another experience altogether. I would not say it is an endeavor, it is an effort. I would say it is an experience totally different. Your mind cannot afford to be absent, because it should actively recreate every image encoded by the author in his works for words are nothing but verbal images or verbal paintings. And if you see it, both interestingly and at times confusingly or intriguingly, the image that is created with every rendezvous or with every meeting of the text is like the images in a kaleidoscope. All of us as children would have played with the kaleidoscope. Can we see the same image twice? No. Every shift or every change of the kaleidoscope's direction will give us a different image and a different lighting effect, isn't it? So with every look, we get a different image in a kaleidoscope. And with every reading of a text, we have a different experience. I'm very sure of it, my dear. I'm sorry, I always feel I'm in a classroom. I was about to say, my dear students, I'm very sure, scholars, that for no reading of a text or no two reading of a text can be the same. I will give you a personal example, because as a young girl, I was quite a voracious reader. And as a young girl, my first reading of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte was as a young graduate, maybe in my BA years. And I could not help but fall in love with Jane Eyre, because she resembled me in many characters. You know, she wanted to have education, she wanted to have freedom, she wanted to live life, enjoy the experiences of the world. Yes, and Jane Eyre caught all my imagination. I did not have a second thinking for Bertha at all. Bertha was lost. She was an animal, as much as ignored both in the novel and both by the readers. But then, when I became a research scholar, especially during my MA and MPhil years, because Mother Teresa University specializes in women's studies, okay? And when we start reading through critical works and how to interpret works critically, other issues or other aspects, social, political, cultural, racial, gender aspects that run in the text started to catch my attention. And, you know, Bertha, who terrified me earlier, now started to raise questions in my mind. And my understanding of the novel altered. And I could say with every reading, that novel does give me a new insight. For a good reading or an ideal reading draws you further and further into the text, and you are literally and figuratively lost into it. You may be wondering, why, ma'am? All of us know this is a very common experience for avid readers. I just wanted to give this background for reading, because I'm going to foreground two literary concepts that we have taken for discussion today, namely rewriting and revisioning, are basically about the reading and the writing process. What exactly do we mean by rewriting? First, I'll give you the technical, what you can say, word for it, or the literal word for an explanation for rewriting. Rewriting is a literary mode that occurs across cultures, genres, and time periods, both transforming and preserving root works. See, understand that word? Both transforming and preserving root works, whilst revealing the protean nature of text, tradition, genre, authorship, and readership. I repeat, rewriting is a literary mode that occurs across cultures, genres, and time periods, both preserving and transforming root works, whilst revealing the protean natures of text, tradition, genre, authorship, and readership. Instances, examples of rewriting, I think it is time immemorial. I will give you a few examples as I'm running through the webinar or my speech. But you must understand, rewriting existed since literature. See, even oral tradition itself was a rewrite of a rewrite of a rewrite. Are you able to understand? So, instance of rewriting can be traced to early literary tradition, even in the era of oral tradition, and in the era where oral tradition was slowly superseded by written works. For all the early poems, parables, and fables inevitably had based themselves on the oral stories. Even our myths, even our epics from Dante, Petrarch, Sophocles, Euripides, I'm confining mostly to European literature. Even our Mahabharata and Ramayana are collections of early oral tales. Sophocles and Euripides all what you can say, in a sense, I won't say completely. Of course, nobody can question the originality of the writers. In are considered rewrites. Am I audible, sir? Am I fine? Is my audio fine?
Yes, ma'am, fine.
Okay. To quote Professor Martin McLean in his lecture entitled Rewriting in the Italian Literary Tradition, he says, every text we read and even every sentence may contain 10 other texts beneath it. See, each sentence or even every text that he doesn't even say text or a sentence. He says each sentence may contain 10 other texts beneath it. When exploring different models and functions of rewriting across a number of languages, they are or were divided into varied categories. See, some may rewrite in the form. For example, when we trace sonnets, we say sonnets originated in Italy and it was brought into English by Watt and Surrey. And of course, then Shakespeare rewrote it, and we have the Italian Petrarchian sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnets. Are able to understand? So the elemental level or the basic fundamental level of rewriting is borrowings, paraphrasings, quotes, references, palimpsests, translations, and of course there are more complex and deep, or what you can say, I can say conscious and unconscious rewrites. This belongs to the unconscious, to politicized, and importantly, what we are talking today, resistant discourses or resistance writings. Okay, in his essays, okay, highlighting variance in literary editions, techniques and goals, Dedna, Bergen Dedna is what you can say, an Italian critique, states that no human author can claim to be totally original. See, this discussion, this contesting, what you can say, this statement, no human author can claim to be totally original, is what you can say is accepted, it is disputed, it is argumented. Still, we understand that there is a kind of a commonality in writings, or there is a kind of recurrent themes, recurrent motives, recurrent imagings, recurrent patterns of characterization. Okay. And now coming back, I'll give you a few examples from the early era. We'll quickly run through the early era. And my focus here today will be on as resistant discourses. See, from Aeschylus' Orostasia, we know it must be taken from a oral tradition. Goethe must have borrowed it from the King's Autobiography. Shakespeare based his historical plays on written chronicles, Holnished chronicles namely. And even last year when we were celebrating 400 years of Shakespeare, we were still debating his legacy. You know, there were discussions, which were his, what were the additions that were further added and all that. And also that, you know, in Dedna, I told you about a written work highlighting variance in literary editions, techniques and goals. He states that Shakespeare relied upon written accounts of the reigns of particular monarchs for his historical plays. But it is also well known that Shakespeare employed many other texts for the plots and details of most of his plays that extended beyond his historical plays. And you must remember, it is a common practice of that time, because they excessively borrowed from Latin and Greek. And another thing that I wanted to bring to your attention was, but can we call Shakespeare plays as rewrites? Because it has been borrowed from what you can say earlier sources. Certainly not. There is his original, what you can say, re-rendering of the whole process. That's what we call as revisioning of the whole historical events. Okay, and that is where the originality of a writer is. Certainly, Shakespeare's works later on, see, he was influenced by a set of writers. Now he is influencing another set of young and budding artists or writers. Okay, Shakespeare's works themselves have been reinterpreted, reworked, and retold countless times. See, BBC recreated what you can say Shakespeare's plays in the digital medium. But nowadays, we have revisioning of Shakespeare's plays. I can give you some of the latest plays that have been rewritten in the visual medium. Visual medium means what you can say, the movies. Okay. See, Shakespeare's works in the 20th century include the classic science fiction film Forbidden Planet, and it is a rewriting of The Tempest. The musical West Side Story is a rewriting of the Romeo and Juliet, and Disney's animated film The Lion King is a rewriting of Hamlet. Apart from the movies and the works cited here, there are innumerable rewritings on the plays of Shakespeare. Even feminists have rewritten the plays from their point of position. Okay, and the practice of rewriting has been the driving force for literature for time immemorial. See, why I am spending some time on saying rewriting as a literary device is, see, as a literary device, rewriting existed for time immemorial. But as a critical concept, though it was discussed, it became it became as a proper critical tool, or with a proper definition and a proper theory. It became a critical tool only in the late 20th century. Okay, that's why I'm just spending a little time on how rewriting is there and seen in literary works. Okay. The history of Western literature is heavily interspersed with rewritings. Homer's ancient Greek epic poems are rewritten by the Roman classicist Virgil in his Aeneid. The classical masterpiece, this classical masterpiece is rewritten by the Italian writer Dante in his Divine Comedy. And Cervantes rewrites Dante in his Don Quixote. The canonical Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf is retold by Grendel, by John Gardner. Of course, even feminist rewriting and is also found in ancient classics. And the Roman poet Ovid in Hesiod draws upon, I'm giving you an example of feministic rewriting based on mythological women, gods and goddesses. Okay, the Roman poet Ovid in Hesiod draws upon female mythological figures such as Penelope, Medea and Dido, and through letters gives voice to these characters who address their godly lovers who had forsaken them. We know the mythological stories, all these women are often flirted by gods and left to them. Now feminists take it and rework upon it and recreate it from their point of view. And another example is Michael B. Roberts' short story, Epistle to Jason, where he presents a new dimension of Epistle. And here she's not presented as scolding or finding fault with Jason for his infidelity, or for fuming in rage, or to pronounce a curse on him, but rather as a woman, she enjoys her time alone and productively uses the time of his absence in writing letters. Thus, rewritings create creatively a canonical work by placing it in the context of the milieu. So that is the difference. How mythology is viewed at that time and how mythology is viewed this time forms the core of rewriting. And if you want an example, what you can say of the drama Eleanor Max Aveling, The Doll's House Repaired, and The Woman's Bible by Elizabeth Cady Stanton are instances again of rewritings from a feministic point of view. Next, I would, ma'am, how can you call this as rewritings? You are repeating that these literary works are rewriting. There is another contention by critics that, okay, or there is a belief in the notion that there are only 7 basic plots. Though this idea of condensing every writing into 7 basic plots is attributed to Arthur Fuller Couch, in the early 20th century, however, this concept resurfaced, and more recently, in Christopher Brooker's The 7 Basic Plots, Why We Tell Stories, which was published in 2004, and the American comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell published The Hero with the Thousand Faces, but it was published in 1949, and it is a work suggesting that the most mythological heroes participate in narratives which share the same fundamental structure called the monomyth. We would have jokingly told, or they say, all epics are about love and war. So it's a simple condensing into a nutshell such big epics. So there is what I would say is there is a kind of a repetition or recurrence of certain themes and certain ideas and certain characters. And that exactly becomes why these works can be considered as rewrites of earlier works. And I'm coming back to that word, the monomyth. The monomyth, and they say, or who say, Joseph Campbell says, according to the monomyth, he says it is the one shape-shifting yet constantly marvelously constant story. William Foster Harris, meanwhile, stated in his The Basic Patterns of the Plot that there are three variations to an universal plot. One is the happy ending, another is the unhappy ending, and the more complex is the literary plot. So such kind of interconnectedness, such kind of universality, such kind of commonality that exists in writings from the days of yore to today and across languages and across regions serves to enforce the idea that texts are constructed on past literary works. Now moving on, so I have established that there is a kind of a rewriting that exists in literature. Now moving on into literary criticism, I would say that there are three core early critics, who founded what you can say rewriting. I will just come to revisioning a little later after this, because both are often used as exchangeable terms. Okay, in literary criticism, it is Roland Barthes in his seminal work, The Death of the Author, who highlights that no text exists in isolation, but are woven from citations of previous texts. This forms the very foundation of rewriting, both as a literary and a critical tool that can not only be employed to create text, but also to evaluate text. See, only when it comes as a critical tool during this period of, only it's slowly rewriting starts to be adopted as resistant discourses. Okay, and Barthes' insistence that nothing is original, but simply a retelling of the sources that have come before it resonates with these studies. In Barthes' mind, each new text is built upon a foundation of all those that have come before it. He says it is a mosaic. Okay, the individual author is insignificant, for the text has been written, rewritten, and many of you may even object, but that is the stance of Barthes. He says, and the author's only power, according to Barthes, is to mix writings, in other words, to rewrite through a process merely akin to compilation. So, of course, there has been counter-discursive critical statements about this. But when we come to rewriting, this forms the elemental stage where rewriting is studied as a critical tool. While Barthes does not recognize authorial originality in manipulating established narratives, his argument extends to all works of literature, regardless of the existence or non-existence of source material. There is a conscious and an unconscious borrowing. Sometimes we think one idea is original. After we have written it, we will realize that somebody else has spoken it. And if we are fortunate, maybe in another angle. Okay. And Barthes also considers the social and cultural backgrounds essential to the process of rewriting. Barthes further elevates the significance of the reader's experience to the degree that the readers themselves might be considered as rewriters. You remember him, what you can say, giving his reader response theory. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. He famously states, these two positions thus demonstrate that there exists a broad range of practices which might also be considered rewriting, which is extending from allusion, intertextuality, interconnectedness, and reader response to revision and translation. Thus, we can identify the very process of rewriting from the early recorded literature, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, or perhaps the Egyptian Book of the Dead, through to the works produced since the invention of print and beyond, now including ebooks and hypertext. See, in your digital platform, even if you go to Wikipedia, when you click, you will have a lot of hypertext. They say that is because the text shares its association with other text. Okay, and so this is also a part of the rewriting structure. Okay, And as scholars have become increasingly aware and interested in the variety of forms which rewriting might take, methodologies with which to interrogate them have also emerged and developed. For example, I would give you a very new field of criticism in rewriting, that is the field of genetic criticism. For example, it endorses inspection of the development of the text from its earliest origins to the final printed or electronic version. This I'll try to give you an what you can say simple example. All of you would remember Sri Aurobindo's epic poem Savitri. I happened to take it when I was in my MA class, and I was handling the class for the students. And as I was browsing through the text, of course, it is a voluminous poem of 28,000 lines, and it is an epic poem. I don't know how far it is famous, I don't know, but I was impressed because he has made Savitri and he has attributed a kind of divinity for the strength of and courage that she had to question Lord Emma. And as I was reading, nearly, it seems, it took him 54 years to complete that poem. And even after his death, he didn't complete it. He was still reworking and reworking. And what you can say, every page had at least 24 times. He corrected it 24 times. That is, he wrote, rewrote, corrected. And the whole process itself was such a long and one considered of rewrites and rewrites and rewrites. So, genetic criticism basically studies how one work has evolved from its early inception stage of writing to its earliest origins to the final printed or the electronic version. And this approach has found particular favor with scholars focusing on canonical 20th century authors. I can name a few authors for you like James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and of course it can be applied to any text that has undergone some form of revision. Often addressing earlier texts, another kind of rewriting is manuscript studies. Manuscript studies underscores transcriptions with differences that are frequently held to be very, very significant. See, when we transfer manuscripts to print, I do not know how far we can take them to be original. Often, the perceptions and the prejudices of the transcriber gets encoded into his writing. So, manuscript studies of rewriting concentrates on how manuscripts get encoded into the print or the digital form. Okay, and famously, the variations between what you can say manuscripts of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Okay, it is considered by many and as one of the beginning of modern English. Okay, and Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, of course, there is a contention that it was borrowed from Boccaccio's Decameron. And can you make a guess of how many manuscripts would be there in the Canterbury Tales? There are 83 known manuscripts of Canterbury Tales. Okay, and each manuscript has its differences, of course. And we think Canterbury Tales has the maximum number of manuscripts, but approximately 130 surviving manuscripts of what you can say the English poem. There is an English poem called as The Prick of Conscience. It's a Middle English poem. And how many manuscripts are there? 130 surviving manuscripts are there. So the sheer number of the texts available or the manuscripts available suggests both popularity and that they were regularly rewritten for those who desire a physical copy. Please switch off your audio and video. In more recent times, rewritings appear to be more conspicuous than ever. 2009, we see Seth Graham transform Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice into Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, a process which involved adapting Austen's original text. And of course, he excluded some passages and he included some completely new sections. And in what you can say, and in many later variations, there were a lot of additions and corrections. Of course, Alfred Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, there are what you can say two versions, with one published in 1833 and one in 1842 are available. for those who seek to compare these two. Then the picture of Dorian Gray exists in 3 versions. So all these versions can be taken side by side, and these rewritings can be compared and contrasted. And I can quote many examples for you. But with critical eyes increasingly alighting upon these competing versions, one is ever more aware that rewriting is a process that can be undertaken by a range of writers. It can be by the original author, by the collaborator, by the editor, or even the reader. So that's what I wanted to highlight when we are talking about multiple versions of, sometimes, mostly it is by the same writer himself of a same work. So rewriting is a process that can happen anywhere. It can happen with the original author, it can happen with the collaborator, the editor, or even the reader. Thus, rewriting is held as an endeavor embedded in the very process of creating and also assimilating literature. Now, in the postmodern era, of course, we have our deconstruction, which was followed by the reconstruction of text. And this led to a lot of varied and conflicting ideologies. The more to dissemble a text led to revisiting the text through the lens of revisioning. You may ask me, Alagimam, what is the difference between the rewriting and revisioning? I do not know. I have read quite a few on these. Both of them involve in this process of rewriting. Revisioning means re-understanding the text from a different angle, and rewriting refers to the texts that have been rewritten, both maybe compiling with the canonical work, or as what you can say resistant or transformant discourses. Okay, so I feel revisioning refers to a more resistant kind of what you can say writing, where the canonical work is totally analyzed from a different angle altogether. See, the more to dissemble a text led to revisiting the text through the lens of revisioning. Revisioning directed rewritings to be discourses of dissent. For it was an age of awakening consciousness. All of us know in the postmodern era, we had post-colonial, we had feminism, we had Orientalism, we had queer studies, we had innumerable schools of thought emerging. And each of them wanted to break from the hegemonic power structures of literature that dictated few terms and that refused to accept a few terms. So they used rewriting as a mode to address the issues that was pertinent to them. So revisioning gained attention, and we should remember, whenever we remember revisioning, we should remember Adrienne Rich. She is actually a feministic critic, but it was she who brought in the term revisioning as a powerful critical tool. In her seminal essay, When the Dead Awaken, Writing as a Revision, I repeat, When the Dead Awaken, Writing as a Revision, she proclaimed, it's one of my very, what you can say, a favorite quote of mine whenever I take in women's studies or feministic criticism. Revision is the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction. It is for us more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. By us here, she refers to women and women writing that have been ignored. Okay, but here it can refer to all proletariats, all who suffered social and cultural subjugation and marginalization. I'll repeat this quote again so that you can understand what revisioning is exactly about. Revision is the act of looking back not only at the cultural and social ideals, but also at earlier literature which propagated the same. Because literature itself is a product of the society. Not only that. See, when I did a lot of women's studies, there is a contention that certain assumptions of something is superior and something is inferior gets encoded as sacred text. So the moment a text becomes sacred, or the moment a text becomes canonical, you cannot contest it. You cannot argue it because it is kept beyond the level of questioning or interrogation. And then it is slowly encoded into the secular writing or literature as such. That is how certain power structures or hegemonial culture extended from one generation to another generation. It was encoded as divine rules and later propagated in literature. Okay, so for revisioning is a method of looking back at past text with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction. And it is not simply a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. Survival to establish me as a person, as a viable presence. So this clarion call of Adrian Rich catapulted revisioning canonical and unquestionable texts for their prejudiced stances, and all proletariats, I won't say only feminists, okay, and all proletariats, post-colonial, okay, wherever they felt or marginalized, made a consistent use of revisioning and rewriting to underscore their cause. That's why I named my speech as Rewriting and Revisioning for Resistant Discourses. Discourses which present another view where it breaks set stereotypical representations of certain people. As I told you in the beginning, the moment you think of India, India is a land where there is multiple, what you can say, confusions and superstitions. It's a land of snake charmers. So that is an angle that we need to break. We have to look with fresh eyes to texts that propagate that and counter it. So these resistant discourses can also be called as counter discursives. Okay, so the cornerstone of any culture is its grandeur in literature, preserved as canonical text. So what are these canonical texts? The legends, the myths, the epics. In these stories, certain class of human beings, whether we like it or not, are repeatedly stereotyped and have been repeatedly and consistently defined and assigned specific roles and virtues by certain authors. It is undeniable. And these stories sustained the very structure of social, cultural, and political organization, and its social, cultural, and gendered division also. Not only the organization, but also the division. Also, these canonical narratives, black is ugly, white is beautiful. All these contentions are stereotypical representations propagated through centuries through literature. If you want to find somebody who is mad or somebody who is a villain, he is invariably outside the European belt. Shylock the Jew. Whenever I don't know, you may differ, but whenever I read The Merchant of Venice, I feel an iota of pity for the marginalization meted out to Shylock. Okay, and he may be a hardcore moneylender, but that is his profession. He could have been, I don't know. I feel he is marginalized by race, right? Then all these canonical narratives, from the folklores to the grand epics, validated the prevailing social institutions, validated, authenticated, justified prevailing social institutions. Hence, the question of how the past in the form of myths, archetypes, traditions, and conventions work in human psyche compelled the proletariats to reevaluate and transform the nature of their unquestioned authority. So this is where rewriting and revisioning come as powerful tools of resistant discourses. So the unquestioned authority of the unchallengeable texts were questioned, interrogated, analyzed, disembodied, and represented. The continuous depiction of certain biased views erased the true representations of the ignored and marginalized, both within the society and literature. To break free from such fallacy required a systematic erasure of the myths passed as universal truths and the moral and religious code of conduct dictated through literature. No, all of you would already would have read a few readings where you would have been introduced to such kind of literature. Literature was and is the most powerful and lasting weapon employed by the powerful or those in authority to propagate and preserve their ideology. The decoding of the plots, characters, images, metaphors, symbols, themes, narrative techniques are important and significant in terms of understanding the prevalent culture and rejecting stereotypes and misinterpretations. Rereading or revisiting or revisioning a classical work opens up an alternate reading, and revising it is a method of resistance, where the writer takes the opportunity to turn the tables of description. Though the early work is acknowledged, of course it is acknowledged for its significance and importance, its ideology is rejected or questioned to illuminate the problems inherent in that ideology. Rewriting was a process of injecting the presence of the ignored and opening for exploration areas conveniently neglected. This is a very important statement of rewriting. I used to say rewriting is nothing but writing the missing links within a text or within the context of writing. Okay, rewriting and revisioning originated as a postmodern perspective that did not hide the past but attempted to analyze and reflect upon it. They provided the counter sides that questioned the received history. And here I have given a quote from Lyotard, which says, rewriting and revisioning question the grand narratives of history and dismantle the idea of a singular truth. And it dismantled, dismantle means completely broke the idea of a singular truth that broke the claim of authority and textual hierarchy, to reveal that the canons, stories, the myths that were passed off as timeless truth, and the stories that sustain social organization and its gendered division of labor can be told differently, was considered the first step in the process of emancipation. Here, I will simplify all that what I have told you through a simple example. All girls are invariably enamored by fairy tales. There were times when I dreamed I could be Cinderella, I could be Snow White. I even visualized or dreamt of a Prince Charming. Okay, but now an adult reading of the text says, why is this what you can say? What is she doing? She doesn't have any control over her life. She just waits for somebody to save her. I'm not talking about man, woman here. How that particular character, Cinderella or Snow White, is presented. And why is there always a cruel stepmother? I think the cruel stepmother has more action than this poor girl. And here, she is the receiver of action and she doesn't become the source of action. And my questions to this was answered when I read a rewrite on the fairy tales. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. It was a fitting reply. I would discuss this book a few lines on this book a little later as I conclude the webinar. But there she presents a totally different view. And we often wonder whether the girls would have liked to be them. Because that's why nowadays Disney comes up with what versions where that girls are able to make decisions on their own. They're equally educated, they want to make decisions. In Beauty and Beast, the recent version, we find her making the choice to go and stay with the beast. And we find her always reading, which the society considers it as very odd for a girl. Okay, so the certain mythical stories, the canonical works, to tell itself that they can be broken, such things can be, what you can say, questioned, a different revision can be done, itself is what you can say, a unique contribution for resistance literature. Okay, the biggest challenge of the rewriters was to shatter the veritable grip of the canons. I actually wanted to share with you the Oxford Dictionary explanation for the canons, because We are talking so much about canonical work in a rewrite. See, the Oxford Dictionary defines canon as a body of literary works traditionally regarded as the most important, significant, and worthy of study. Those works of especially Western literature considered to be established as being the highest quality and most enduring value, the classics. I repeat, according to the Oxford Dictionary, what is a canon? A body of literary works traditionally regarded as the most important, significant, and worthy of study. Those works of especially Western literature considered to be established as being the highest quality and most enduring value, the classics. These obvious means collection, were significantly by authors who enjoyed privileged and powerful position in society, and they naturally advocated precepts favorable to them. The canons also made the collected cultural stand of the society. That is very, very important. See, when you read through Girish Karnad's Nagamandala, I felt it as a feministic play. Of course, it is a feministic play where he will question so many mythological concepts. One simple example is the divine interruption whenever the chastity of a woman is what you can say questioned by the society. So these canons also made the collected cultural stand of the society. Even today, there are foolish people who believe that if you are chaste, there will be a divine intervention. God will come and save you. Are you able to understand? So it assuredly epitomized the values of the dominant social group. I give one more small quote here. Barbara Herrnstein, in her Contingencies of Values, states, since those with cultural power tend to be members of socially, economically and politically established classes, the texts that survive will tend to be those that appear to reflect and reinforce established ideologies. These advocated ideologies become the creed, doctrines, and myths on which the society functions, and they are active, integral, and often the uncontested component of culture. Rewriting and re-evaluation of the literary canons emerged as the primary engagement of resistant writing and criticism in the 1960s. They aimed at constructing a literary legacy that transcended the boundaries of race, ethnicity, class, and sexuality. Early texts were evaluated from a social, political, cultural, historical, and gendered contexts, and misinterpretations of characters were corrected through the process of rewriting. Here, the silenced characters were given the power of articulation and the force of utterance, through which the prejudices in literature were counterbalanced. Okay? Having made clear on how revisioning and rewriting became central for resistance discourses, let me substantiate it by drawing some examples from, I'll give you an example of one or two books. And the first book that I'm going to introduce to you is The White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice. Okay, and this is a seminal book in rewriting. Okay, because it simultaneously, what you can say, rewrites already a feministic text, a Victorian canon, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And it approaches that canonical work, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, from two angles. One is the post-colonial angle, and another is the feministic angle. So a single book presenting two powerful schools of thought. Okay, and within this book, there is a re-rendering of the master narrative. And this enables the master narrative to be analyzed from the perspectives of gender and race. And alternative subjectivities are presented and they topple the accomplished protagonist of the hegemonic world and word. And here, this subversion, this is a subversion or a rewrite, and it is as individual and as original a book as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, because it infuses truth into what is silent and dormant. So these resistant writings or discourses, you must remember one thing. Apart from rewrites, see, when it is a general rewrite in literature, either that, what you can say, the association with an earlier work is open or it is hidden, or conscious or unconscious. But here in resistant writing or discourses, they maintain a conscious relationship with the previous text, like the title, plot, names of characters, drawing quotation from the masterwork, I won't say masterwork, the early work, sorry, footnotes, epigraphs, and they employ many other literary devices to show that they stand in open contention to that early narrative. Okay, and I told you, I'm just introducing you an example, that is the Wide Sargasso Sea, which can be analyzed powerfully from two angles. One is the post-colonial angle and another is the feministic angle. See, when I read the novel by Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice, already I had my own doubts when I was reading Charlotte Bronte. What is the story of Bertha? Why is she such a girl who has been confined to the attic? And that mad woman confined in the attic is a recurrent and a repetitive, obsessive image for feministic writers. It is a symbol of how women are confined within the house or imprisoned within the house. And Bertha stands, always as a, whenever I read through the novel, she's presented more like an animal. If you see, no human attribute will be contributed to her. Have you seen her utter one single word? No. Oh, I heard an animal-like laughter. So, as an adult reader, I won't say this bothered me when I was a young girl. As an adult reader who had read widely on women's studies and feministic interpretations, and also is aware of colonial and post-colonial implications and explications, the characterization of Bertha really bothered me. Why should she be a Creole? That mad woman, why is she a Creole? Are you able to understand? And the answer is beautifully given by Jean Rice in her novel, The Wide Sargasso Sea. Okay? It is a rewrite of Charlotte Bronte's much admired work. And remember, Jane Eyre by Bronte itself was a feministic text. And what you can say, I cannot talk about rewriting and revisioning without this text, because it is a pioneering work in this field. For Jean Rice's work is credited with the honor of having heralded rewritten works as a method of interrogation and resistance in the modern feministic literary renaissance. She lent voice to the marginalized, mad Creole Bertha, the first wife of Rochester in Bronte's novel, and through a narrative reversal gives a credible story that has been erased and silenced by racial and gendered structures of patriarchal society. The revisionistic element highlighted by the study of this work is how a female character relegated to the periphery can be brought to the center of a narrative, and by taking the position of a protagonist or being the subject of a novel, can enable a completely volte-face, complete reversal of perceptions, which in turn quantifies a viable female voice and a literary her story. See, whenever we talk about feminism, one group confines itself, oh, this is not my business. Interestingly, this novel is not only a feministic novel, it does not only give voice to a silenced female subject, it also addresses issues of colonial. And using this novel as an example, I'll quickly summarize in another 5 to 10 minutes on what you can say, what are the various post-colonial and feministic resistance that it has offered to the earlier narrative of Bronte's Jane Eyre. Okay, Jane Eyre is among the most prominent rewritten works in feministic writings. Don't ever think it is only what you can say, Jean Rice who has written it. Many, multiple rewrites have been done, taking or focusing on different characters in the novel. Some rewritings of this work are of Bronte's Jane Eyre are White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice, Adele Jane Eyre's Hidden Story, The French Dancer's Bastard, The Story of Adele from Jane Eyre, Thornfield Hall, Jane Eyre's Hidden Story by Emma Tennant. Another writer whom I want to bring to you, especially if you are interested in women's studies, is Emma Tennant. She's a Scottish writer and she has written around 20 to 24 works. But if you see, 17 to 18 of them are rewritten works. She herself has written 4 rewritten works on Bronte's Jane Eyre. How interesting, isn't it? And Adele, Grace and Celine, the other women of Jane Eyre by Claria Moyes, I Am Jane Eyre by Tina Rowell, Jane Eyre's Husband, The Life of Edward Rochester by Tara Bradley, Jane Eyre, My Private Autobiography by W.J. Harrison, Jane Eyre's Rival, The Real Mrs. Rochester by Claire Holland. So, Bronte's Jane Eyre is a single example where one narrative can become the source for a multitude of rewritten works that are, and you know, the whole literary scenario changes with these written works, because every rewritten work offers something more, or it offers as a counter discursive, or as a transforming element to the original text. Okay, let us now in particular take a closer glimpse at the White Sargasso Sea, the post-colonial and the feministic elements. See, this novel was written in 1966 by Dominican-born British author Jean Rice. Remember, she's Dominican-born. That's why she could empathize with that Creole factor of Bertha. And Sylvia Murrell observes, okay, Rice seeks to coin a new idiom, a rhetoric of the feminine thought, resistance to narrative and semantic closure, and through the subversive potential of irony, parodic mimicry and intertextuality, she tries to rewrite the history of Bertha. And this White Sargasso Sea is heralded as the most seminal rewriting among the early feminist reworking, for it deconstructed the postulated hegemonic discourses and presented the emanating voice of women's emancipation. White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice, as a revision of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, narrates the ignored story of the woman exiled in the attic in the edifices of colonialism and patriarchy. The rewritten novel is an attempt to reclaim the subjugated voice of both gender and race, for it simultaneously posits the position of both the colonial and the gendered other. The new narrative, I'm referring to the Sargasso Sea, posits the double marginalization of Bertha Mason as a Creole and as a woman. Jean Rice in White Sargasso Sea authenticates her existence and gives the power of discourse to Antoinette Kossove. See, now Bertha is given a new name. That name is Antoinette Kossove. And another very unique feature about this resistance, rewriting as resistance discourses, is they give voice to the muted characters in the earlier work. Okay, so we are able to hear their side of the story, who is bound in chains and made inarticulate as Bertha Mason in the dark, dingy, and sequestered mansion of Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. The novel is simultaneously a post-colonial and feministic critique that attempts at making her story heard. True to a rewritten tale, the novel of Jean Rice takes an exiled character. So I'm now giving the features of a rewritten work. First is taking an exiled character of an influential work, and she places her as the subject of action and articulation, voice. Rice's heroine is Rochester's first wife, Bertha Mason, the mad renegade character of Bronte's novel, and she renames her. First is giving her a name, an identity, as Antoinette Kossove. I am actually doing a gross injustice to the book if I'm trying to give its various aspects within this 5 minutes that I have in my hand. I would recommend all of you to have a look at it. It's a beautiful read, I can assure you that. Okay. Her Creole and Catholic background, her childhood in the West Indies, courtship and marriage to Rochester, Rochester's initiation of her madness. See, when you see all this, you will see how Rochester's behavior as a colonizer plays a very huge role in victimizing Bertha as the colonized. I hope you all know who is Creole. Creole is the Jamaican islands where they are blacks, but they're half black and half white. That is, white masters will have their parents as slaves, and they are born as half blacks and half whites. So they are neither accepted by the natives nor are they accepted by the whites. So they live in a, what you can say, a very fluid situation. Okay. So Rochester's initiation of her madness by citing the supposed lunacy that runs in her family, his actions that lead to Antoniette's confinement as a demented woman in the attic of Thornfield Hall, and a revenge by fire to escape the repressive systems that engulf her form the plot of the novel. The story is told in 3 parts. Antoniette Kossove is the narrator of the first part, and it deals with her childhood as well as the inner dynamics of the relationship between the newly emancipated slaves, the Creoles and the white Europeans. See, slaves here refers to the Dominicans who have been freed from the colonial rule, the condition of the Creoles who are half white and half black, and also the role of the white Europeans in the newly independent Jamaican country. An unnamed Rochester figure, the husband of Antoniette, who comes to the unfamiliar land with its intense, extreme climatic natural characteristics. See, another is the regional difference. You know, she establishes how their life is totally different from another, the English life or the British life, and how taking Antoniette Kossove from her Dominican locale was like actually uprooting her. Okay, and see, that's why you will have vibrant descriptions of the landscape. So intense, extreme climatic natural characteristics narrates the second part of the novel. And so Rochester, actually the novel is broken into 3 parts. First part by Antoniette, she's the narrator. Interestingly, what you can say, Rice gives a narrative voice to Rochester also. So Rochester narrates his experience in the Jamaican island as he marries Antoniette and tries to, what you can say, he doesn't try to, he has taken the property already and he tries to build a kind of working condition with Antoniette, Antoniette Kossove. And so he narrates the second part. Of course, it's very brief, and the third part is also brief. The third part is once again narrated by Antoniette, who is now named by Bertha by Rochester, and she details the confinement within the cardboard walls of Thornfield till her escape through fire. The rewritten work not only interrogates the conventional phallocentric power structures represented in literature of the early era, but it also offers a challenge to the imperialistic colonial values expressed in the parent text. It not only shatters numerous patriarchal assumptions, but also serves as a socio-cultural text that offers resistance and becomes a point of inquiry that interrogates the imperialistic phallocentric values expressed in the source text. The novel, in the process of providing narrative power to the muted female voice of a canonical text, further validates the West Indian post-colonial position. Jean Rice shares the same geographical position of Bertha, the first wife of Rochester. Rice was born at Roseau, Dominica, and while her father was a Welsh doctor, her mother was a Creole, that is, a white West Indian. When she was 16, she moved to England and for 10 years lived a rootless, wandering life, roaming the continent. In many ways, her life paralleled the condemned mad wife Bertha of Jane Eyre, whose image haunted the memory of Jean Rice. She was unable to reconcile with the askew and mad presentation of Bertha Mason. I'll just give this one small quote of hers. In an interview with the Breland is a magazine, Rice reflects. She says in her own words, "When I read Jane Eyre as a child, I thought, why she should think Creole women are lunatics and all that. What a shame to make Rochester's first wife, Bertha, the awful mad woman. And I immediately thought I would write the story as it might really have been. She seemed such a poor ghost. I thought I would try to write her alive. So this is the essence of rewriting and revisioning. So Rice had a personal knowledge of West Indies and its history and its mad Creole heiresses who were alienated, menaced, and at odds in life. And so she presented that society in White Sargasso Sea. These women were exploited both by the blacks and by the whites for their dowry. These women lived in no man's land and were victims of exploitation both from the natives and the whites. So the novel lays bare this social alienation, and even in the very first line of the novel, you have that word. The Jamaican ladies had never approved of my mother because she pretty like self, and no one came near us. They hated us. They called us white cockroaches. So these repetitive words of anger and deep resentment of the natives for Creoles sets the mood for the tale. Are you able to understand? So the novel offers both a colonial and a post-colonial perspective. So, and the justification of the two places, England and Jamaica, presents how post-colonial perspectives have a strong play in the novel. So the locale of West Indies as the background, it gives them context for multiple interpretations in the text. And it becomes the symbol of the lost beauty crushed by the imperial and the ruthless ruler, the whites. So I have just given you one example because of the lack of time. As I told you, Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber is a rewrite of the fairy tales, namely the Beauty and the Beast, the Red Riding Hood and all that. There are innumerable resistant, discourses. And I have presented only two simple aspects for it. I would request you to explore further in the topic. And I will mention a few if you want. Marian Wiggins' John Dollar is a rewriting of William Golding's Lord of the Flies. And Sue Rose' Great Expectations is, Sue Rose, Estella, Her Expectations is a reworking of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. There are innumerable retellings on the Bible, on the female characters of the Bible. And there are, even Shakespeare's The Tempest is one of the most commonly rewritten work. And what you can say, as I told you earlier, Emma Tennant has written nearly 17 novels. Okay. And thus, I would like to conclude my speech by saying that rewriting and revisioning are contemporary critical tools that have given us the strength to question what has been unquestioned and given us authority to voice where we have been rendered muted. Thank you so much and happy learning. I hope I didn't bore you. If you have any questions, you can ask. Suresh sir, Gunasekharan, anybody is online?
Yes, ma'am. I am.
Ma'am, yes, ma'am.
Dear participant,
has asked
now
me.
the session has.
Yes, sir. Please continue.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.
Ma'am, please continue.
One student had asked me whether there is a rewriting in Indian literature. Definitely, multitude of rewritings are there in Indian literature. You take Ramayana and Mahabharata, every character from, take Mahabharata, Ramayana, Bhima, Arjuna, you will have a retelling. So there are innumerable retellings. And what is that? Every female character will have a retelling. That is a different context by itself. That's why I didn't touch upon it. And honestly, I had a few examples at the last, but I was running short of time, so I had to conclude very quickly. Okay, so innumerable rewritings are there. If you want, I can just put up a list of a few of the popular rewrites, and sir can post it to you in your WhatsApp group or something, because anyway, there are 3 days of webinar series is there. Okay, anybody else has any questions? Please check mythological writings. Sudha Shastri, she's a mythological writer. She reinterprets from a women point of view so many mythological stories. Actually, I wanted to specialize only in Indian literature. And many a times, I run to European literature because that's more of a common platform where all can buy. One day we will do something on that. Any other queries? Any other queries? Joseph sir, if there is no other queries.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, wonderful. Wonderful.
Sir, sorry, there is one person, Somnath Shankari, who has asked, are post-colonial and feministic rewritings are then case of rewriting and our case of rewriting, and not all post-colonial and feministic writings are rewritings. It's a thin line. See, when I consciously take early text or canonical text, or as we say in double quotes, I don't want to use that word master narrative, but often we say it is a master narrative. And when I consciously use it and question it from my angle, a post-colonial angle or a feministic angle, then it becomes a rewrite. I will make a conscious connection with the previous text. Then it is a rewrite. All writings are not post-colonial, or all post-colonial feministic writings are not rewrites. That's why I told it is a prominent critical tool to offer resistance. Okay.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we had very nice and wonderful feedback also through messages. To cite one or two, Mr. Sasikumar, lecturer in English, SVGM College, Andhra Pradesh. He has said that very excellent presentation. Okay. As well as Wilson Fernando, he has given us a great session. Privileged to attend, ma'am. Apt examples. Also, the last one, Dr. Krishna Kumar, and he has a message that nice presentation. This assistant professor of English, University College, Trivandrum. So we are getting wonderful, very nice feedback from the participants. On behalf of the department, on behalf of the college and principal, I thank you so much for having accepted, having delivered such a nice and thoughtful information. You have kept the session live throughout the session. You kept it very lively. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now I call upon Dr. K. Sangeeta to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, am I audible, sir?
You are audible.
Yes, of course.
Okay, sir. I'm honored to have the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks on today's webinar, Revisioning and Rewriting as Resistance Discourses. On behalf of PG Department of English, Government Arts and Science College, Kovilpatti, first, I would like to propose my heartfelt gratitude to our resource person, Dr. Assistant Professor of English, Women, Tirunelveli, for making this session very interesting. More effective online teaching in literature. The way you explain the topic is exemplary, ma'am. It gave us a new perspective in revisioning literature. Thank you, ma'am. Sincere gratitude to our college principal, Dr. R. Ravichandran, sir, supported in all our endeavors in the webinar. I would like to render my heartfelt thanks to our beloved HOD, Dr. Joseph Suresh, sir, for his constant moral support and guidance. He is an amazing, wonderful person who puts to reality on whatever brings welfare for the students and academics. Thank you, sir. I would also like to thank my colleague, Mr. Gunashekaran sir, guest faculty of English, and Mr. Vignesh, our academic friend, for technically supporting and helping in putting together this webinar and making it a grand success. My humble gratitude to God Almighty for showering us with His abundant blessings. And finally, I thank all the participants of our college and from various colleges for being here in large numbers. Thank you all. The feedback form link is posted in the chat box, and I request all the participants to submit the feedback forms. The e-certificate will be sent to your registered email. So I thank you all once again. Stay home, stay safe, and stay positive. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so much. And thank you, every one of you, those who were present. And now the participants can leave the platform. Good.